America is usually sold as a miracle story. Born in rebellion, then forged into global power. After 2 world wars, it stood stronger than ever. But that story starts far too late, because this land did not begin with America. It did not begin with colonies or European sails. Long before them, this continent already had history. It held nations, traditions, and ancient human worlds. This was never empty land waiting to be claimed. It was already lived in, known, and named. The first peoples came here thousands of years ago. They crossed north, then spread across the continent. Over time, many cultures rose, not just one. They built trade, settlements, alliances, and political order. This was not silent wilderness, it was civilization. Even early Norse contact changed little in the long run. Then Europe turned west, searching for new routes to Asia. And from that moment, everything began to change. When Europeans sailed west, they did not find emptiness. They stepped into lands already lived in and fully formed. But that balance did not survive for long. Then came a name that changed everything: Columbus. In 1492, he crossed the Atlantic and reached the Caribbean. And Europe suddenly realized something massive. There was land here. Land to take. Land to exploit, settle, and control. But the heroic version hides something darker. For the people already living there, this was the beginning of destruction. Enslavement, violence, forced labor, mass death. Even Columbus himself was accused of extreme cruelty. But the worst killer did not carry a sword. It came silently: disease. Smallpox and epidemics spread faster than resistance. Entire societies collapsed before they could even react. Then the race for power truly began. Britain beat France and came out on top. But victory left Britain with a heavy bill, and London decided the colonies should help pay it. That decision lit the fuse. For the colonies, this was never just about money. It was about power, about who had the right to rule. Parliament imposed taxes, but the colonies had no real voice, and everyday goods became symbols of control. That is when frustration hardened into principle. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It became a warning. Protests spread. Boycotts grew. Crowds filled the streets. Britain answered with force, not understanding. Troops entered Boston, and tension turned explosive. Then, in 1770, soldiers fired into a crowd, and the Boston Massacre changed everything. 3 years later, the break widened again. In Boston Harbor, tea hit the water. That was not just protest, it was open defiance. London answered with punishment and tighter control. But pressure only pushed the colonies closer together. Delegates met. Militias armed. Riders carried warnings. And soon, words gave way to gunfire. At Lexington and Concord, the first shots were fired. Now this was no longer protest. It was rebellion. The colonies formed an army, and Washington took command. Then in 1776, they made the biggest move of all. They stopped asking for rights and declared independence. And Britain was no longer crushing unrest. Once fighting began, this was no longer a dispute. It became a war for survival. Britain had the empire, navy, money, training, command. The colonies had far less and needed far more. Washington knew this war would not be won easily. His army lacked food, supplies, training, and stability. Men left. Morale broke. Defeat always felt close. New York proved how dangerous the gap really was. The British hit hard, and Washington was forced back. That lesson was brutal. Courage alone was not enough. So Washington's real victory became something simpler. He kept the army alive. Through retreats, winters, and near collapse, it endured. And survival itself became strategy. Every British failure gave the rebellion another breath. Then the war widened beyond the colonies. Saratoga proved the rebellion could actually win. That changed everything. France entered the war. Spain moved against Britain too. Now Britain faced a much larger fight. The colonies finally had what they needed most, a real ally. Even then, independence was still not certain. The war dragged on through years of pressure and loss. Then came Yorktown. British forces were trapped by land and sea, and when they surrendered, the illusion broke. Britain could not fully take the colonies back. In 1783, peace made the break official. The United States was now independent, but winning freedom was only the first challenge. Now the new country had to learn how to govern itself. Its first system proved too weak to hold things together, so the revolution entered a second phase. Not military this time, constitutional. The Constitution built a stronger national framework. Then, the Bill of Rights defined core liberties. By the end of the century, the Republic had survived. A new nation had been born, and its real rise was only beginning. Independence won freedom, but it did not bring safety. The Republic had a map, not a secure future. Then in 1803, everything suddenly got bigger. The Louisiana Purchase nearly doubled the nation at once. But owning land was easier than truly knowing it, so Lewis and Clark went west to map the unknown. And their journey fed a growing national obsession. America began to believe it was meant to expand. That belief became manifest destiny. It sounded noble. In reality, it justified conquest, and native nations paid the price first. Under Andrew Jackson, removal became federal policy. The Trail of Tears turned expansion into suffering. Even then, the Republic kept pushing outward. Texas, war with Mexico, and Western land changed the scale again, but every new mile pushed the country closer to civil war. By the mid-1800s, America was growing fast and cracking inside. The question was no longer whether slavery was wrong. It was whether this country could survive with it. Every new territory made that question more dangerous. Would the West enter free or slave? That was not just politics. It was a fight over America's future. Compromises kept coming, but none solved the real problem. They delayed the collision and made it worse. Then, Kansas turned the argument into blood. Americans were killing each other before the war even began. Then came the election that shattered the last illusion. Lincoln won in 1860, and the South saw a threat. So states began leaving the Union. And slavery was at the center of that break. Then, Fort Sumter turned crisis into war. The Civil War had begun. The North had numbers, industry, and resources. The South had resolve, strong generals, and a cause it would kill for. What followed was slaughter on an industrial scale. Then Lincoln changed the meaning of the war itself. The Emancipation Proclamation tied Union victory to slavery's destruction. Then Gettysburg broke the South's momentum. And by 1865, collapse was closing in. Lee surrendered. The Confederacy was finished, but the cost was horrifying. The Union survived, slavery ended, and Lincoln was assassinated. America remained one nation, but it would never be the same again. The Civil War ended, but peace did not fully arrive. The Union survived, but the country was still broken. Now, America had to rebuild and keep expanding. Reconstruction promised change, but conflict never really disappeared. Slavery was gone. Bitterness, resistance, and injustice were not, and while the nation healed, it kept moving west. Railroads spread, settlers advanced. Native lands came under new pressure. For some, that meant opportunity. For others, the Black Hills became one of the clearest examples. Gold was found, promises were broken, and war followed. This was not an isolated clash. It was expansion by pressure, force, and dispossession. Then America started looking beyond the continent itself. By the late 1800s, Spain was weaker, and the United States noticed. Then, in 1898, the US Main exploded in Havana Harbor. Spain was blamed, and war came fast. The war was short, but the consequences were huge. America took Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now it was no longer just a continental power. It was starting to act like an overseas empire. Then, Theodore Roosevelt pushed that reach even further. Panama and the Canal turned ambition into global leverage. This was more than trade, it was a statement of arrival. By the early 1900s, America was larger, richer, and more assertive. This one is kept tight and ends by pulling cleanly into World War I. When Europe went to war in 1914, America stayed out. 2 oceans made distance feel like safety. But neutrality did not mean true separation. Trade tied America closer to the war. Then German submarines pushed everything toward a breaking point. The Lusitania sank, and the shock reached across the Atlantic. Still, America did not enter right away. Then, 1917 changed the equation. The Zimmerman telegram helped push Washington into war. Now America was no longer watching from afar. Its troops helped shift the balance in Europe. Victory came, but it came with a cost, and after the war, America stepped into a bigger global role. Then came the Roaring Twenties. Jazz, cars, radios, cities, speed. The nation felt unstoppable. Then the illusion broke, the crash came, and prosperity turned into depression. Banks failed, jobs vanished, survival replaced optimism, and before that wound healed, another war arrived. Pearl Harbor ended the illusion of distance. Now, America entered World War II at full scale. Its factories, fleets, and armies pushed across the globe. Then came the most devastating choice of all. Atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and the world changed with it. When the war ended, America stood stronger than ever. This was not just victory. It was superpower arrival. World War II ended, but peace did not truly begin. It created a new world order, with America at the center. The old empires were weaker. A new rival was rising. That rival was the Soviet Union. The alliance of war quickly turned into a struggle for the future. Capitalism and communism were now competing for the world. Europe became the first great dividing line. Germany was split, Berlin was split, and the tension kept growing. America rebuilt the West, but it was strategy, not charity. Then the Cold War took shape. Not open war, but pressure, spies, nukes, and proxy battles. The world now lived under permanent tension. Then the rivalry moved into science and space. Sputnik shocked America and changed the race overnight. So the United States answered with NASA and the moonshot dream. And when Apollo 11 landed, America turned prestige into triumph. But power abroad did not erase the crisis at home. A nation preaching freedom still denied it to millions. So the civil rights movement forced America to face itself. Martin Luther King Jr. became one of its clearest moral voices. The laws changed, but the deeper wounds did not disappear. Then, another shock changed the country again. On September 11, America was hit in full view of the world. The illusion of invulnerability collapsed in a single morning, and the response reshaped the entire 21st century. Wars expanded, security tightened, the world changed with America. That is what makes this story bigger than one nation. America rose through power, ambition, innovation, and force. But that rise also carried conquest, slavery, war, and contradiction. And that is why the American story still matters. And that is the contradiction at America's core. It calls itself liberty, strength, opportunity, and progress. And in many ways, that image is real. Few nations rose so fast or shaped so much. But none of that rise came from innocence. This nation rose on land already inhabited. It expanded through dispossession and built wealth through forced labor. It spoke of freedom while millions lived in chains. It praised democracy while excluding millions from its promise. And even at its peak, force followed its rise. That does not make America easy to judge. It makes America impossible to ignore. Because this is not just a success story. It is a story about power, how power is built, justified, admired, and used, how it creates and how it destroys. That is why the American story matters so much. Not because it is pure, not because it is heroic in every chapter, but because it became too powerful to ignore. From revolution to expansion, from civil war to industrial might, from world war to superpower status, from moon landings to modern invasions. The United States did not just enter history, it bent history around itself. So understanding America takes more than admiration. It takes memory, it takes honesty, it takes looking straight at both sides of the myth. Because this power was not built cleanly. It rose through struggle, bloodshed, reinvention, and force. And that is the truth behind the power.